Welcome to Ewtn's coverage of the Synod on Youth from Rome. It's a pleasure to have you with us on this feast of St. Teresa of Avila, or Teresa of the Child Jesus. I'm Brian Patrick, along with Matthew Bunson. Dr. Matthew Bunson is an Ewtn senior contributor, senior editor for the National Catholic Register, and we're here for the next couple of weeks covering the Synod.
We are. This is one of those moments in the life of the Church that we have an opportunity to reflect on what we can do for young people, how to keep them in the faith, how to help them develop their vocations, develop their spiritual lives, how also to impact culture. And it's striking that we begin this broadcast about 24 hours or so after the canonizations that we covered yesterday of Pope Paul VI, who actually established the Synod of Bishops, and of course 6 other saints, including the martyr Oscar Romero.
Synod is a term that's used within the Church for not just this meeting of bishops, but we have synods at the parish level and at the diocesan level. Let's talk about what a synod is and how the Synod of Bishops is different and the same, I guess, in some ways as these others.
Well, in a nutshell, synod from the Greek means an assembly or a gathering. Now, it's often translated into the Latin as like a concilium or a council. There are obvious differences. We think of the Ecumenical Council, the Second Vatican Council from 1962 to 1965, that sort of established the groundwork for what became the Synod of Bishops. It was established by Pope Paul VI in 1965. But Pope Francis has added an important wrinkle in sort of how we interpret the meaning of the word synod. He sees it as a traveling together. He has made the synod one of the, I think, really important touch points of his pontificate in his vision, not just for the way that the bishop should communicate and advise the Pope, and we can talk more about that in a second, but also the collegiality and also giving direction to the Church in a way that he keeps bringing bishops to Rome. And he wants them to focus on certain topics that are important to him. So in his pontificate, we've had a synod on family in 2014 and 15, and now we're talking about youth in the crisis of the modern world. And let's also not forget that right now this is a synod taking place under the shadow of the clergy sexual abuse crisis.
How many participants are there? And this is a synod of bishops, but it's not all bishops.
It's not all bishops. Typically, a synod will have around 250 to 300 what they call synod fathers. Now, the way that Pope Paul envisioned it was to have, flowing out of that Second Vatican Council, an advisory body of bishops to come from around the world to consult, that he can lean on them for advice. One of the things that we see in the regular sessions, about every 3 years or so, of the Synod of Bishops, is a set of topics that are important. The very first one, I think in 1967, had to do with strengthening the faith in the modern world. For those in the immediate aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, it was already clear that there were problems developing. We had the sexual revolution, we had all of the political and social upheaval of the 1960s, and Paul wanted to bring them together, how to strengthen the faith, which became a recurring theme of his pontificate. Now, over the years, we've had some pretty remarkable synods. I think in particular the ones organized by Pope John Paul II that led to some of the greatest, what they call post-synodal apostolic exhortations, which is a reflection of the Pope on the work of the Synod. As someone once said, it sounds like something you need to take medicine for.
First get an x-ray.
First get an x-ray after I have a post-synodal problem. But these are documents, these are the reflections by the Pope on the work of the Synod. And now, rather controversially, we all are aware of Pope Francis's post-synodal apostolic exhortation on the work of the 2014 and 2015 Synod, Amoris Laetitia. But we can go back almost a generation before to John Paul II, as I was mentioning, with documents like Christa Fidelis Laici on the role of laity in the life of the Church. And that phenomenal document that still is of impact to us today. And I especially want to point out Pope Benedict XVI's apostolic exhortation on Scripture, which was Verbum Domini in the life of the Church.
Now, the Holy Father is known to show up early for these synod sessions. He mixes with some of the young people. He talks to some of the media. He's been known to talk freely to the media, often creating a little bit of confusion in some areas, but he's really just sort of hanging out with these people before these sessions starts. I find that rather unusual for a pope.
This is an enterprise on the part of Pope Francis, as I was just saying, that the synods are important to him. And I know we want to talk a lot more about that with Edward Penton coming up. But for Francis, he sees this as a key mechanism for advancing his vision for the church. So it's not surprising in a way that even though he's about 81, that he's up very early, making his way from the Casa Santa Marta, where he lives, taking that walk around the aula to the very doors of the Synod Hall, where he can begin his day's work. It's also, I understand, and it's been his constant pattern to do in the individual synods that he's held, 14 and 15, that he will speak rather freely throughout the synod, that he will interject. Now, that's the right of any pope. Right. But Francis clearly wants to steer this synod in the ways that he sees are important. And what are some of the themes? Well, he's talked about mercy. He's talked about helping the theology of accompaniment, of walking with people. So we go back again to Francis's own vision of what a synod is supposed to be, and that is a journeying together.
There are various factions within this group, each probably trying to get their points across. One of the groups that seems to have a block of sorts are the African bishops, that we hear that they're very outspoken and that they kind of act as a group versus as individuals.
Well, the African bishops, including a number of African cardinals, in 2014 and 2015 were vital voices in the whole discussion on the life of the family in the modern world and the crises that are facing it. They, in many ways, are better positioned than some of the bishops in the West to understand the impact of things like what Francis refers to as ideological colonialism, the imposition on Africa and developing countries of so much of the toxic culture that we have in the West, of the abortion culture, the contraceptive culture, and materialism and secular atheism. So the bishops arriving here have a very similar commitment to what is needed for young people today. Things like clarity, an authentic spiritual life.
But also, when it comes to conscience, there was a discussion of a clear definition of conscience versus a more vague definition.
Right. That's one of the keys that you find with the African bishops, that they are very concerned about clarity, that we cannot be using ambiguous language when we're speaking to young people. We can't just fall back into sociological language or euphemisms in the hope that somehow we can communicate with them. Young people, the African bishops, are firmly convinced need clarity, they need authenticity, and they also need that fidelity, which is one of those recurring themes, again, what you find in synods, of helping people to be faithful to the teachings of the church, because it is in that fidelity to the teachings of the church that true freedom and true happiness can be found. And the goal of this synod, presumably, is for young people to find that vocation, to find out what it is that God really wants for them, to find that happiness.
We're going to talk more about vocation later on in the show with one of the young auditors from Australia. I did want to focus a little bit on this emphasis on the sacraments as well. I find it interesting that as the sacraments were discussed, that there was, seemed to be a heavier emphasis on penance or the sacrament of reconciliation, even over the Eucharist. And I would say that some people would see that as a good sign.
It's a good sign because if we go back to the African bishops, one thing that they're acutely aware of is the impact of sin on culture. And for young people to develop a clear understanding of what sin is, but also how to root out sin in your own life, that sense of personal conversion, the availing yourself of turning to the sacrament of reconciliation, of penance, to put yourself in a right place to form your conscience and the right place to receive the Eucharist. And to make that truly a part of your life as a Christian, as a Catholic, but also as a human being striving to be authentic.
I would think that many young people grew up without any connection to the sacrament of reconciliation because of that whole generation that just didn't use it, didn't make use of the grace that comes through reconciliation. So they were not even, they maybe received their first confession and maybe every once in a while, but have to be completely reintroduced to what this sacrament is and the grace that accompanies it.
Well, I remember Pope John Paul II convoked a synod, I think, on the idea of reconciliation, on the sacrament of reconciliation, to reawaken an awareness of it in the world. And it was John Paul II, I remember vividly when he came to the United States, I think it was in 1979, and in his recurring visits to the U.S., when he said, "America, Your communion lines are long, but your confession lines are very short.
And the confessionals aren't open in some churches. That's getting a little bit better.
Or for half an hour on one day a week.
Yeah. Well, there's a press briefing each day, and we attended that today. And one of the things that I found impressive from that briefing was the Dominican. We had 3 religious congregational leaders for the Jesuits, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans. Father Bruno Codore with the Dominicans pointed out that the church must now pass from listening to conversation. There's a difference. There's a give and take in conversation. He says it is dialogue where change comes from, and he says things must change. And he said that the future of the church is openness to change. Now, there are those who say that the Synod itself needs to change.
Well, there are those who would also argue that the Synod has perhaps changed too much under
Yeah.
Pope Francis. We have seen a sea change of rules and regulations and procedures under Pope Francis that has really alarmed a lot of people, and I know that's something that we're seeing a lot of reporting on, and certainly the questions at the press briefings have focused very heavily on the procedures and processes. But this idea of openness to change begs the simple question of what kind of change are you talking about?
That's the key right there, yeah.
And are we opening ourselves not to change but to revolution? Are we moving away from reform to revolution?
And Jesuit Father Arturo Sosa talked specifically about changing the Synod structure.
We have been making steps of including more people and more voices in the Synod. So the first Synod was only bishops, then some auditores were included, some experts, and then some, in this case, young people, the last case, families. So the structure is changing.
Pointed out that perhaps there's been too many changes. I wonder where you see it going from here.
We're going to have to see what exactly turns out in the process itself. We had a statement today from the head of the communications office for the Vatican, the new dicastery of communications, Paolo Ruffini, who made the observation that he actually anticipated a lot of the questions that were being...
He came out firing right off the bat.
Right off the bat at the press conference that no, a lot of these structural changes that you think are happening aren't. For example, it sounds like a minor thing, it was an inside baseball, but each paragraph, he said, of the final report will be voted on, and it will need a majority of votes to be accepted. Now, that is something of a victory, and we'll hear more about that from Edward Penn.
And it's important, too, in the sense that they're not voting on the entire document. They're voting on rejecting or accepting each individual paragraph.
Yes, and sometimes these can be very controversial paragraphs and controversial sentences. Mm-hmm. And to have that series of votes then is crucial because you're getting the temperature but also the wisdom of the bishops who have gathered here from around the world. And you are asking them to put their authority on the line, to put their own credibility on the line with everything that's in that document if their signatures are going to be on it.
You're watching the coverage of the Synod on Youth on EWTN, and we're going to continue this coverage throughout the week, each evening here on EWTN with encores. You can go to EWTN.com for those times. I'm Brian Patrick, along with Dr. Matthew Bunson. I would like your take, Matthew, on a couple of terms or phrases that Father Sosa used. He talked about the digital world, and he said it's not just a change in the way we communicate. He called it true anthropological transformation.
Anyone who uses a cell phone today knows we're watching an anthropological transformation. In other words, we are kind of changing as human beings.
We are.
There's studies that tell us that our walk is becoming shorter.
We're all hunched over.
And we're taking baby steps because we're afraid to walk into a wall or something while we're texting or right into traffic. But he's hitting on something important, I think, and he's referring to what Pope Benedict XVI called the digital continent. There is out there an entire world that needs to be evangelized. And we cannot cede that territory to so much of what is out there in the internet. But at the same time, we also have to be aware then of the risks of what is out in that digital continent. And to recognize that technology itself is bringing about massive, almost shocking change to culture, to wider society. it is transforming us anthropologically.
We will talk a lot more about that and expand on that concept of the digital world as we continue to cover the Synod on Youth from Rome here on EWTN. Next up, from the National Catholic Register, the Rome correspondent Edward Penton joins us. Stay with us on EWTN. We're entering the third week of the Synod on Youth at the Vatican, and you're watching on EWTN from Rome. I'm Brian Patrick, along with Dr. Matthew Bunson, and we're joined by a special guest. He's always special, Edward Penton, the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Register. You've been following these things for a long time, Edward, and I just want your take, first of all, on the discussion today about the voting procedures.
Yes, well, this came as somewhat of a relief for some people, I think, because there was some questions at the beginning of the Synod that things weren't very transparent. And the important factor of how the voting is going to be done, we didn't know. It was all rather vague. But today we found out that it's going to be done point by point, which is very important because then we can see how many votes each paragraph gets by the Synod Fathers. And apparently we're going to also have two-thirds majority rule in this as well. So we're going to have, it's going to be up to two-thirds of those Synod Fathers are going to have to agree on each paragraph for them to go through. So that's an interesting development.
How many of the 250 participants are Synod Fathers who will actually vote?
It's a good question, but obviously I think 266 Synod Fathers are there, so I think they're all going to vote. But there will be some who, in a change during this Synod, will be voting who wouldn't normally vote. And we have two non-ordained religious who will vote this time, male religious, which is a new development.
Now, that's actually happened once before, hasn't it?
Well, we've had one, I think, but this seems to be becoming an increasing development, more people being able to vote. So.
Well, we were talking a little while ago about the fact that Pope Francis places immense importance on the Synod as part of his pontificate, as his vision, ecclesiastical, but also increasingly almost ecclesiological, to put it in theological terms. What is it about the Synod that Francis finds so significant?
Well, he is very much, I think, and others believe to be the case too, that he's taking very much the cue from Cardinal Martini, the late Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, who wanted a synodal church. And he wanted a synodal church because he wanted it to be more horizontal, if you like. So it has more input from the laity, from people on the grassroots. And it coincides with Pope Francis's vision for a sort of what he calls an inverted pyramid, coming not from the top, but coming from the bottom. So the governance of the church comes from the people, not from the theology of the people, as he talks about it, not from the hierarchies.
You know, Pope Paul, in establishing the Synod, coming out of the Second Vatican Council, saw this as an advisory body. Do you see a tendency or a movement under Pope Francis for the expansion of the authority of the Synod? Very
much so, yeah. I think this Synod too, because we had this new apostolic constitution which came out shortly before this Synod, really implemented very much it gave the Synod more authority and more weight, and made it almost more kind of deliberative, in the sense of, perhaps a good analogy is a parliament. It makes it more like a parliament. It's not a parliament, but it makes it more like it because it gives it more sort of legislative weight, if you like, in parliamentary terms.
Revisiting the vote, there was a bit of a hubbub, if I might call it that, about why only men are allowed to vote on the various paragraphs in the final report. There are even an online petition of some sort, I guess, that's out there saying that why are women being treated as second-class participants?
Well, this is a good question because, of course, you've got these two non-ordained male religious who are allowed to participate, and women are saying, well, why can't they participate? You know, why can't women participate as well? And so the people at the three religious at the press conference today were rather dumbstruck by the question. They didn't know quite how to answer it. But Father Souza, the head of the Jesuits, said, well, this is done within the structure of the Synod of Bishops. The Synod of Bishops are the protagonists in this. And so women need to be considered, he said, within the structure of the Church. So they still have a voice. They're participating very much in this Synod. but he says that within this particular structure, which reflects the Synod of Bishops, they don't have the equal rights that men have.
In an article in the National Catholic Register, you talked about Cardinal Napier's comments about the Eurocentricity, I think is the term he used.
It wasn't me, it's just an article by J.D. Flynn, a very good summary of what Cardinal Napier said on Saturday, where he talks about the needs for the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document, to be less Eurocentric. He said the revisions have been Eurocentric, and he wants it to be much more reflective of the universal church, particularly the church in Africa, because the church in Africa is growing, as many people know. It has a lot to offer. Cardinal Napier said the developed world could learn a lot from the church in Africa, and so he wants their voice to be heard more. And I think it's not only Cardinal Napier, but you've heard this from other Synod fathers, particularly in Africa, who feel that their voice hasn't been heard enough so far.
This Instrumentum Laboris, again, that blueprint for how the Synod will function, which was drafted, of course, some months before the start of the Synod, is not especially popular, is it, among many of the bishops? No, I mean, there have been quite a few criticisms of it. Even before the Synod began, of course, Archbishop Chaput had a very lengthy and detailed critique of it. And I think one of the main problems people have with it is that they say it's too sociological, there's not enough theology, not enough about the church in it. And I think some Synod fathers I've spoken to, they're a bit unclear about what they're supposed to do with this, whether they're supposed to actually revise it, how much the Instrumentum Laboris is going to be part of the final document. So there's a bit of confusion about that. But yes, it has been a weak point of the Synod so far, and we'll see how the changes are made to it in the final document. And again, that Eurocentric viewpoint of sort of focusing on things that are of concern perhaps only to the Germans or even to the Americans. That universality that you touched upon, going back to the Africans, they are seeing that having lived experience of so many of the problems. And in our discussions about procedures and processes, can we lose sight of the fact that this is actually a synod on youth and the needs of African young people, much as young people in Asia and elsewhere have problems that are fundamentally different from those of the West? Yes, exactly. And of course, the big controversy over the LGBT inclusion, the acronym, the loaded acronym included in the Instrumentum Laboris, that of course is not agreed upon by the vast majority, if not all of the African bishops. That's not a problem for them. For them, it's much more to do with poverty and immigration and these kind of issues. It's not to do with these issues of sexuality, for example, which is primarily in the West. So these have to be balanced out and probably will be, we hope. What's the danger of leaving that acronym in this document? It's kind of borrowing from secular culture, really, in referring to it that way. Well, Archbishop Chaput, of course, gave his intervention about this early on, and he said, as Catholics, we don't define each other by identity. Our identity is based on human dignity, that we're born in the image and likeness of God. It's not about sexual orientation. And so these acronyms, which are very much part of the homosexual lobby, they use them to push their agenda in various institutions like the UN and so forth, and now there's a fear that they're using it to push their agenda into the church, and so this is the problem for many people about this. Is there also a concern among the African bishops and among other bishops that we have that as an issue, but we also have the idea of redefining family? Yes, I think so, and that again is something which is primarily the domain of the West. It's not a concern in Africa, where structures of family are very much known, and the order of people is very much known in the family in Africa and Asia, and so this is something again which is there's a divergence, if you like, between the two hemispheres. Well, I understand there are about 43 African bishops involved in the Synod. Many of them and many other bishops who are attending are young and fairly new, and maybe to a Synod for the first time. How does that affect the dynamics? Yes, well, I've heard quite a lot that people have, I mean, Cardinal Napier said he's been to 8 synods. He's never felt such an infusion of energy and life in a synod as you get. Of course, you would in a youth synod. It kind of stands to reason. But, we hope so, anyway. We hope so, yes. Yeah. Especially Catholic youth, so who should be full of life. So that's a good thing. In his homily on Sunday at the canonizations, Pope Francis talked about youth being 100% Christian. There's no
a little bit. It's all the way in. And you wanted to share some thoughts about the Iraqi martyrs and how they inspire us. I mean, they were willing to die for their faith.
Yes, that's right. Well, there's a very good testimony from a young Iraqi, 26 years old, Chaldean Catholic called Safa al-Akoshi. I interviewed him on Friday after his speech. He was very interesting in that he said his advice really to Catholics in the West or in the United States and Europe is not to be dismayed by the church. He said you don't go to church because of the Pope or the bishops. You go to church because of Jesus Christ, and the church is Jesus Christ. And he said, in order, just remember that. And he said, and also remember the martyrs who died in Iraq, killed by Al-Qaeda or ISIS, who he said were very steadfast in their faith, regardless, and they died for their faith. And it wasn't, about the hierarchy. They weren't dismayed about what was going on in the church, although that's obviously very serious. But he said that's the essence of the faith, and it shows very much the depth and the vivacity of the faith in Iraq.
And to that point, in your interview, he made mention of the fact that terrorists target the young.
Yes.
Because they know they are the future.
That was another interesting point. Yes, he said, in fact, he said, I think, that half in the last year, or I can't remember the time frame, but a lot of the youth killed by terrorists, a lot of the people killed by terrorists are youth, and they go for the youth because they know that they're the hope of the country, and if they can get the youth dismayed and lacking hope, then their victory is half won. So yes.
As you look ahead to the rest of this week, what are you looking for, Edward, in the Synod?
I think we're going to be looking at the second part of the Instrumentum Laboris, which will be quite interesting because they're looking at the sort of pastoral sort of solutions to these issues that they've been bringing up. So that's very useful. I think will also be interesting to see if Humanae Vitae is going to be raised in this second half, because so far it's hardly been raised at all. In fact, I don't think it has been raised in any of the general congregations. So, and that's been surprising to people because, of course, the issue of contraception and the negative effects of that has been huge on young people and breakup of families and relationships. At least this is a common theory of many academics, and so that I think will be interesting to see how much that gets brought up.
And we've just had the canonization of the author of Humanae Vitae, so that should at least be on their minds.
And the 50th anniversary of the document.
Yeah. So. Speaking of authors, Dr. Matthew Bunson is the author of a new book. This is what, number 54?
I think so, yes.
St. Paul VI. It's a great read. I've been learning a whole lot about Pope Paul VI, canonized just yesterday here in Rome. I understand that his name has come up a bit in the Synod discussions today, but the direct reference to Humanae Vitae, perhaps not. Are you confident that it will be brought into these discussions?
It seems to be. There seems to be a hope also from, I think, some of the African bishops. Cardinal Napier, he said he will bring it up this week in his intervention, I think in a small group. So I think there will be a mention of this, and if not Humanae Vitae specifically, then the issues of contraception and the effects of that. Also on ideological colonization in Africa, for example, these agencies trying to get Africans to adopt the same approach to contraception that we have in the West, that's an issue that they're very concerned about as well. So yes.
All right. Edward Penton with the National Catholic Register, a Rome correspondent. We appreciate you being with us tonight for our kickoff coverage and hope to have you back on with us again.
Thanks. Great to be with you guys. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Matthew Bunson, always great to have you with us. We're going to stick around because we have a special guest. We're talking about the Synod on Youth, and we have the young auditor from Australia joining us next as our coverage of the Synod on Youth from Rome continues here on EWTN. This is EWTN's coverage of the Synod on Youth from Rome. We thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick along with Dr. Matthew Bunson. And there's really a longer name than the Synod on Youth. What's the full name of the Synod?
Well, this is the Synod on Youth and Discernment of Vocations. So that itself tells you something about what we're trying to accomplish here.
All right, so we are talking about vocations with Sebastian. Say your last name for me.
Duo.
From Australia, a youth auditor. Your thoughts on vocation?
Vocation needs to be, the understanding of vocation needs to be broadened. It needs to encompass what young people see as vocation. And in my work with a huge amount of young people around Australia, one of the most common questions I get, particularly from older students, is, what am I meant to do with my life? What is it that I'm called to do? And they come from students that are living actively in their faith and students that are disconnected from their faith as well. And so I think the church has a really crucial role that it needs to take in stepping into this and accompanying young people to help discern their vocation, not in purely a religious sense, but in a broad sense, understanding that, teaching can be a vocation, that serving others is a vocation in different contexts, and that, all of us, each and every single person in the university is called to live out a vocation in a number of different ways.
What do you see as your vocation at this point in your life?
At this point in my life, my vocation is definitely in youth ministry. That is where I work, and I would be kidding myself and kidding a lot of people if I didn't identify that as my vocation. I know that that's where I'm currently called to be, and I know that until I feel that I'm called elsewhere, that is where I'm called to be.
How did you know that call?
A few years ago, actually, I was, had a very different plan for my life. I was studying engineering at university, and was really fortunate. I'd been doing voluntary parish youth ministry for a while, and what happened was that while I was studying, I was, a typical sort of uni student looking for a job, and I was fortunate enough to land a job doing youth ministry in a school. And it was through that process of working in youth ministry part-time, studying full-time, that I actually began to realise that I was feeling called to do more of the youth ministry and do less of the engineering. And I took a little bit of a break from that university just to actually stop and pray through what I was feeling, to actually discern what I was feeling. During that process, I went over to World Youth Day. And it was actually through that process of talking to people who I trusted, talking to people who knew me well, talking to people who'd accompanied me throughout my life and throughout my journey, and also praying through that process, that I really, really felt called to pursuing youth ministry in a bigger capacity. And lo and behold, I actually was offered later that year a full-time position in youth ministry, and had that call sort of affirmed.
Affirmation, yes.
Well, you've talked about prayer and discernment. Here we are at the Synod of Bishops with gathering of the world's bishops to help young people discern their vocation. In your own setting, in your own culture, and in Australia, and talking with young people, what are some of the challenges that you see them facing in exactly that process that you've just undergone of discerning what God wants for them in their lives?
Well, in my experience with young people, discernment is the word discernment in itself is a difficult concept to grasp for the majority of young people out there. And I think there's different ways to approach discernment, and it's one of the things that we've just been discussing in our small groups at the Synod, trying to grasp what we mean by discernment and also what young people mean by discernment. And it was really largely agreed upon that discernment takes many different forms, and there's many different approaches to discernment, and there's many different ways to accompany young people through their discernment. That prayer is definitely a part of discernment. Prayer is definitely an aspect of discernment, but discernment can be more grounded as well. That discernment can be and needs to involve looking at the current situation of life, looking at where you are and where you want to be, looking at what you enjoy, what brings you joy, looking at the skills and talents you possess, the things that you're good at, and looking at what the world needs of you. That all those different aspects, both the situation you're in, how you're living, and what you're feeling, are all aspects of what discernment needs to encompass.
I wonder what your thought is on communication between adults and young people. We're seeing that in a very active way at the Synod, but in overall life. Do you feel that young people have the voice they need, or do they feel talked at or talked over by adults?
That was actually one of my big points coming to the Synod. I feel like young people in the majority of contexts or the majority of situations that I've experienced feel that they are talked at. They feel that, particularly when they're in the church, they're asked to do things, they're asked to say things, they're asked to believe things that don't necessarily adhere to what they believe that don't necessarily sit right with them. And that's where young people feel that the church isn't for them, that the church isn't relevant to where they are in their lives. I feel like the Synod has been a really great example of the dialogue that needs to continue and the dialogue that the church needs to pursue with young people. That in this Synod we've been really, really fortunate to have young people speaking to bishops, and there's been a really evident desire for the bishops to actually approach young people, not only in the small groups, not only in the conversations, but during the breaks. It's been really obvious that during the breaks, when we have morning tea and when we're standing outside and waiting for the sessions to start, that the bishops and the cardinals and the people attending haven't stuck to themselves and haven't kind of dissociated from the young people, but actually made a conscious effort to go and speak to the young people and start that dialogue, begin that process of dialogue. And I think Pope Francis has modelled that himself really perfectly in the way that he welcomes people as they're walking into the Synod Hall.
Did you talk directly to him at any point?
I did. I've had an opportunity to have a few conversations with him. Unfortunately, my Italian isn't too great and his English isn't too great, so the conversation's been limited. But yeah, he has made a very conscious effort to speak to people.
In the press conference today for the Synod, I think it was Father Marco Tosca, the OFM conventual Franciscan, told the story about a bishop who was accused of being a fake by a young girl, and the importance of authenticity. What does that mean to you as a young person looking at bishops, at those who are in authority, who you turn to for advice in shaping your future, especially your spiritual life?
Yeah, in fact, in Father's story, he said that the bishop asked the young lady, "How can I be less fake? Tell me."
My experience in working with young people is one of seeing and experiencing that young people are really great at detecting authenticity. They have a really great gauge on when someone is telling them truthfully what they believe, or when someone is telling them what they think they should believe but not living that out themselves. And I think in some senses and in some cases there are bishops and there are people and there are leaders that speak to young people, leaders of the church that speak to young people and aren't authentic in what they say. They tell young people things and they talk at young people and ask them to believe things that they aren't necessarily practicing themselves. But I think that there are, at the same time, many great bishops and many great leaders out there who do practice what they preach. They do stand by what they say, and young people are, you see and you experience, and I've experienced that young people are drawn to those bishops. They can tell that those bishops and those leaders are being authentic. They can tell that those people really believe what they're saying, and young people are drawn to that.
There was also mention by some of the participants in the press briefing that young people need to be given the tools and the paths to participation in the church. What would they be?
The tools and the paths to participation in the church are one, opportunity. Young people need the opportunity because, as we've just said, we've had that conversation that young people often feel like they're talked at, they're asked to do things and asked to believe things. But we need to acknowledge that young people aren't, one of the terms that was used in the Synod, that young people aren't empty glasses. They bring with them their own experiences, their own knowledge, their own wisdom, and their own sense and their own sense of their reality and their circumstances. And with that comes, a depth of knowledge that the church and bishops and cardinals and all leaders can learn from as well. So young people need to be given an opportunity to actually share their voice, to actually share their experiences. And the church and church leaders need to learn to listen to young people and learn from those experiences. That's a really crucial thing and a really important thing that the church needs to take into account, and that's something that the Synod needs to actually do and a result that needs to come of the Synod.
Australia, like other places around the world, has been rocked, and the church in Australia especially has been badly bruised by the sex abuse scandal. From your conversations with other young people, how is that impacting youth in Australia?
It's very difficult. I've seen so many young people, and myself included, that are angry at the church. Abuse is something that shouldn't occur anywhere, but the fact that it's occurred in a church, which is a place that's supposed to be a spiritual home, a space that's supposed to care for people, support people, accompany people, a space that's supposed to, a place that preaches truth and justice, and a place that has always been about love and belonging. The fact that abuse has occurred within the structure of the church is just appalling and horrendous, and young people are angry and disappointed and want transparency. I think the only steps moving forward from the church is that the church needs to become more transparent, more honest. It needs to acknowledge its mistakes, and not only acknowledge them and apologize for them, but show that they're actually clearly trying to do something for it and make amends for their mistakes.
One more question before we let you go. You are being heard. The young people are being heard. The church leaders are listening and learning from young people. What do you think young people can learn from Mother Church?
I think young people have a lot to learn from the church. Young people can learn that the church is ultimately a place that empowers people, and asks people to become their best selves. A place that I've been fortunate enough to be able to call home for the majority of my life now, and a place that I've been able to grow, both as a person, both as an intellectual, both as a human being, and as a child of God as well. I think that the church, that young people can really, really learn from the church that it isn't just about teaching and being talked at and a place where you experience the Mass, but it's a place of community, it's a place of family, it's a place where if you don't have something and if you're lacking something, the church can provide.
Very refreshing, and I have a little surprise for you. We were once young people.
Hard to imagine, I know.
But it's so great to hear your take on this, and we thank you for the participation in the Synod and for our coverage on EWTN.
Thank you.
All right. When we come back, Dr. Matthew Bunson and I will wrap things up from Rome for this evening's coverage of the Synod on Youth. Stay with us. EWTN's coverage of youth discernment, the Synod on Youth Discernment and Vocation continues from Rome. Brian Patrick here along with Dr. Matthew Bunson. And Matthew, there are 3 steps to this. They call it experiencing, interpreting, and choosing, but what it boils down to is see, judge, and act.
Yes. Well, the instrumentum laboris, that blueprint that we've been talking about, and we're likely to be hearing a lot more about this instrumentum as our coverage continues over the next 2 weeks, because this, again, gave us the structure for the way the Synod is going to function. And it's built on 3 pillars of see, judge, and act, or as I think they put it, experiencing, interpreting, and choosing. Now, the origins of see, judge, and act in Catholic social teaching go all the way back to 1961, and Pope St. John the 23rd, in his social encyclical Mater et Magistra, in which he was trying to lay out for the world, in the time just before the Second Vatican Council, a way of looking at a situation in the world. And this is, let's remember, a time of the start of the upheaval of the sexual revolution was just underway, but we were also nestled in the middle of the Cold War, when it looked like everything was going to fall apart around the world.
We were facing the Cuban Missile Crisis around that time. It was a terrible time. I was a little kid, scared to death.
And, well, I think a lot of people were. And then, of course, came the Second Vatican Council, when people were also kind of scared to death as what that was going to bring. And John the 23rd, with that vision for the way the world could assess situations, and he said, you need to see what is the reality that confronts us, and then we need to assess it, we need to judge what is actually happening here, and then we have act. Now, those 3 pillars then have been looked at each of the 3 weeks that the Synod has been going on. So we just finished that 2nd week in which they focused on judging. Now we're getting into what realistically is the hardest part, and some would say the most perilous part, because we are now going to discern, based on everything we've seen, how to act, how to solve the problems that young people are facing today.
So there are like 14 working groups that have been discussing these things among themselves. beginning tomorrow, don't they report to the larger gathering?
Yes, with each of the finishings each week of these discussions, it goes to what's called the general congregations. And you're going to have a relator general, to use the terms. These are basically the officials of the synod who are sort of husbanding or shepherding this process. So they're going to have a series then of interventions. That's what's going to be going on over the next few days, in which the bishops have an opportunity to speak. It's been frustrating for those of us in media and for a lot of Catholics around the world, because most, if not the vast majority, of the interventions in this synod have not been published. Now, there was a tradition that they would all be published. So there have been a few complaints about transparency.
Why did that change?
It was the decision, I think, of Pope Francis and Cardinal Lorenzo Baldisseri, a name that we're also going to be hearing more from, who is the Secretary General of the Synod.
He's kind of running the whole thing.
Who's running the whole thing, basically put in charge of the whole thing by Pope Francis, who was made a cardinal, essentially, to help him with that task. That they wanted to have as free a conversation, free of exchange of thoughts and concerns as possible. So by not actually publishing every word that's being said, they felt that this was going to be a more authentic conversation. Some would argue that we need more transparency, not less, that we really, as Catholics, would like to know what the participants of the Synod are actually saying. What are their reflections? What are their concerns, especially the bishops from around the world? As we've been hearing from Edward and others, there are concerns on the part of the African bishops, for example, who want to be heard. And publishing the interventions would be a great idea.
But there were some legitimate concerns from bishops earlier on who did speak their mind, and then those statements were published, and they're like, what? Everybody knows what I said. So there are both sides to this. But yeah, it seems odd that in the interest of more transparency that we have less transparency.
And in a way, we're kind of going back to the way it was before Pope Francis, because he actually complained that there was too much structure, that things were too pre-planned. Now, once we get through all of those interventions, we then break down into these little groups, the different, I think, 14 language groups, and that includes English, of course, Spanish, you have a French group, you have a Portuguese group, and a German group. And they will then be discussing what's happening in what are called the circoli minori. In other words, small discussion groups. In fact, Sebastian referenced the fact that he was taking part in one of those. And that's one of those areas where, again, you have that freedom to speak with each other. And from the little tidbits that we're getting from those who are actually taking part, the discussions have been pretty lively. About a lot of the pressing issues that they have, and I think it's pretty clear there have been disagreements, which are, again, not untypical for any church gathering. Anyone who knows anything about church history knows that ecumenical councils and synods can be fraught with a lot of disagreement, discussion, debate. That's very healthy. So then we'll have the reports of these small language groups, much as we did from week 1, and we're just expecting the reports from week 2.
I know we have a lot of people praying for the outcome of the Synod, that it is a positive outcome for the Church. What would you see as a positive outcome of this gathering?
I think there are a couple of things. The first, and I would argue the most important, is that coming out of this, we have a clear statement from the participants of the Synod of Bishops that can then be handed to Pope Francis that pulls together the true concerns and solutions that only the Church can offer to young people trying to live the faith in the modern world. That then Pope Francis will take that document, having been approved, we voted on for each paragraph, and can then draft an apostolic exhortation that really does reflect the will of the Synod, but that actually can do good. There's always this temptation and this tendency to think that these apostolic exhortations, post-synodal apostolic exhortations, will simply be unread for the rest of the history of the Church, that they go up on a shelf somewhere and no one pays much attention to them. Well, as we've seen in the history of the synods, go back to John Paul I with Christi Fidelis Laici and other documents, they can actually be very significant turning points in the life of the Church and can have a direct and very positive impact on those for whom they are meant.
This Pope has been very proactive with young people, especially in terms of social media, interaction with them in the digital world. Do you expect Pope Francis to continue that into this post-synodal, whatever you call that thing, and really communicate to them directly And will the bishops have that opportunity as well?
My understanding is that there could be a strong likelihood that at the very end of this synod, as we have seen with other synods, that the bishops who are gathered are going to issue a series of messages to young people. There were messages at the end of the previous synods for families. Now, one can argue and debate the quality of them, whether they were relevant, what actually they accomplished. But those sorts of messages that can be put out on social media can have a very good effect in starting to frame the discussion that's going to happen after. Now, we have to acknowledge the fact that Amoris Laetitia, the apostolic exhortation that flowed from the synods of 2014 and 15, fraught with devastating controversy and a great deal of argument. And yet, within that post-synodal apostolic exhortation, there is also a great deal of important theological discussion to help families in the world. We can only hope that there isn't that much controversy surrounding whatever comes from this one, and that it, again, can actually do a lot of good.
Well, one of the complaints was that there was not clarity. There was a lot of confusion. So if the clarity that you talked about earlier is part of this, that
yes,
should help to solve things a little bit. We want to remind you that EWTN will continue to cover the Synod on Youth, Discernment, and Vocation from Rome each day this week and the following week until the final Mass of the Synod on the 28th of this month. So there's a lot to be covering. There's a lot to be looking for. We also want to remind you that this broadcast can be seen again in your area. Best go to EWTN.com or EWTN's Facebook page for those times in your area. We'll be joined by Father Raymond D'Souza as well as Father Thomas Petrie in upcoming coverage, as well as many interesting guests, hopefully some of the bishops and cardinals and young people participating in the Synod. Dr. Bunson, always a great pleasure to have you with us. A beautiful evening here in Rome, and we'll try it again tomorrow.
And let's all keep praying for our Synod Fathers and for the Holy Father.
Beautiful. We thank you for joining us again, and stay with EWTN for complete, truthful coverage of our Holy Catholic Church.